What happens when Hollywood's most respected actor sits across from late-night television's most relentless interrogator? Viewers couldn't believe what unfolded when Denzel Washington joined Stephen Colbert for what was meant to be a routine promotional appearance. Instead, the segment spiraled into one of the most intense on-air confrontations in recent memory, ending with a walkout that left the studio in stunned silence. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a comment below, because you won't believe how this played out. Last night's episode of The Late Show began innocently enough. Denzel Washington, promoting his latest directorial project, strode onto the stage with trademark confidence, flashing that easy, magnetic smile that's charmed audiences for decades. The crowd erupted in applause as he took his seat across from Colbert, ready for what everyone assumed would be another lighthearted, late-night chat. But what followed over the next 25 minutes would become television legend. The tension began almost immediately, after the first commercial break. Colbert, known for his razor-sharp wit and increasingly confrontational interview style, had clearly done his homework. But this wasn't the careful preparation of a host paying respect to a Hollywood icon. It was the setup for an ambush. "Denzel, welcome back to the show," Colbert began, that familiar smirk already tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You know, I've been thinking about your career lately, and there's something that's been bothering me." Washington leaned back slightly, calm and composed. "Ask away, Stephen. I'm an open book." "Well," Colbert said, leaning forward, his tone shifting from casual to cutting, "you've made some interesting comments about the media and Hollywood lately. You've been pretty critical of what you call manufactured narratives in entertainment journalism. Some might say that's a little hypocritical, considering how much you've benefited from that same system." The room grew noticeably quieter. The audience could feel the temperature drop. Denzel's smile didn't fade, but those who knew him could see a flicker of steel behind his eyes. "I wouldn't call it hypocrisy," he said evenly. "I'd call it honesty. There's a difference between appreciating opportunities and staying silent when you see the industry losing its way." His voice was steady, but a sharpness crept in. "I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've seen how the game is played, and what happens when people chase clicks and controversy instead of truth and substance." Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed emboldened. "But isn't that exactly what you're doing right now?" he pressed. "You're here promoting your movie. Aren't you participating in the same system you claim to criticize? Using the platform when it suits you, then condemning it when it doesn't?" The question hung in the air like a dare. Washington straightened in his chair, the shift subtle but unmistakable. This wasn't an interview anymore, it was an interrogation. "With all due respect, Stephen," Denzel said, his tone low and measured, "you're mischaracterizing what I said." The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift. "I've never condemned the industry. What I've called out is the tendency to sensationalize, to create controversy where there is none. To value entertainment over integrity." "Integrity?" Colbert echoed, his brows arching in mock surprise. "That's rich, coming from someone who's made millions pretending to be other people. Tell me, Denzel, when you're up there on screen, where does your integrity come into play?" A ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd. Even Colbert's biggest fans could tell he'd crossed a line. The playful banter was gone. This had turned personal. Washington's jaw tightened. For a man famous for his calm precision, the tiny gesture spoke volumes. "You know what, Stephen?" he said quietly, his voice edged with restrained heat. "I think I see what's happening here." Washington's voice took on a new edge, not louder but somehow more commanding. "You've decided, instead of having a conversation about my work, about the film I'm here to promote, you'd rather turn this into some sort of gotcha moment for your audience. You want to create a spectacle." Colbert shot back, his smile growing tighter with each word. "I'm just asking questions, Denzel. Questions I think the audience wants answered. You've positioned yourself as a moral authority in Hollywood, but you're still cashing those studio checks, still playing the game you claim to despise. I'm just trying to understand how you reconcile that contradiction." The tension in the studio was palpable. Audience members shifted uneasily in their seats, some casting glances toward the exits. The camera operators, usually prepared for anything, seemed uncertain. In the control room, producers debated whether to cut to a commercial or let the confrontation continue. Washington leaned forward slightly, then leaned back with deliberate control. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of 4 decades in an industry that had chewed up and spit out lesser men. "Let me tell you something about reconciliation. Stephen," he said, his voice low and steady. "Every day I reconcile being an artist with being a businessman. Every day I reconcile wanting to tell meaningful stories with the reality of commercial filmmaking. But what I don't have to reconcile is being honest about what I see happening in this industry, even if that honesty makes some people uncomfortable." Colbert's voice rose a notch, his composure starting to crack. "Uncomfortable?" He chuckled, though the sound was strained. "Is that what you think this is about? Making me uncomfortable? Denzel, you've been taking shots at late-night television, at comedy, at the very format we're sitting in right now, and now you come on my show expecting what, exactly? A free pass? A platform to promote your movie without any pushback?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. Washington's face shifted from professional courtesy to something far more intense. Genuine anger, though still measured, controlled. It was the kind of fury that had made him one of the most formidable actors of his generation. "I expect basic respect," Washington said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The same respect I've shown every interviewer, every journalist, every talk show host I've sat across from in 40 years of doing this job. But apparently that's too much to ask." The stage was set for something unprecedented. 2 titans, each a giant in their respective fields, locked in a battle of wills neither seemed willing to lose. As the commercial break music began to swell, the viewers knew that what they had witnessed so far was just the beginning. During the break, backstage was electric with tension. Producers huddled in frantic whispers, calculating damage control. Washington sat motionless in his chair, his eyes locked on some distant point, unmoving. Colbert paced behind his desk, his energy restless, like a predator preparing for the next strike. The audience, still buzzing with nervous anticipation, had no idea what was coming next. When the cameras rolled again, Colbert's demeanor had shifted completely. Gone was the jovial, affable host welcoming a beloved guest. In its place was something colder, more calculating, the look of a man who'd chosen to burn bridges rather than build them. "And we're back with Denzel Washington," Colbert announced to the cameras, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Before the break, we were talking about your criticisms of the entertainment industry, but I want to dive into something you said last month at the AFI tribute." Washington's posture stiffened. He knew exactly what was coming. The recognition flashed across his features like lightning before a storm. "You made some pointed comments about how certain segments of the media—" Colbert's eyes narrowed. "And I'm paraphrasing here, manufacture outrage for profit while hiding behind the mask of social responsibility. That was quite a mouthful, Denzel. Almost sounds like you had someone specific in mind." The gauntlet wasn't just thrown now, it was hurled with surgical precision. Washington's hands, which had been resting calmly on the arms of his chair, tightened into fists. The room seemed to hold its breath. Washington's hand slowly clenched into fists. His voice, while quieter, was imbued with a calm yet dangerous authority. "Stephen, if you're asking me to name names, you're going to be disappointed. I speak in principles, not personalities." His words dropped to a register that his co-stars and directors knew all too well, a signal to step back. "But since you brought it up," he continued, his voice tightening, "let me be crystal clear about something. When entertainers masquerade as journalists, when comedy becomes a weapon instead of a mirror, when platforms are used to tear people down instead of building understanding, yes, I have a problem with that." The studio went dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. Colbert's face flushed, and the trademark smirk he wore so often morphed into something far less charming, a grimace of frustration. "Masquerade as journalists?" Colbert's voice rose an octave, his anger beginning to show. "That's rich, coming from someone who's never spent a day in a newsroom, never broken a story, never had to meet a deadline under pressure." He leaned forward, his tone now biting. "Tell me, Denzel, what exactly qualifies you to lecture the rest of us about journalistic integrity? Your Oscar? Your box office receipts?" It was a direct hit, and everyone in the studio felt it. Washington's eyes narrowed, flashing with fury that went beyond professional disagreement. "What qualifies me?" he said, each word deliberate and measured. "Is watching talented people, real journalists, real entertainers, real artists, get pushed aside by blowhards who think a clever quip is the same as actual insight. What qualifies me is seeing an industry I love turn into a circus, where the loudest voice wins, regardless of whether they have anything worthwhile to say. The personal nature of Colbert's attack was unmistakable now, and the shift was palpable. Colbert's face went from flushed to pale, his grip tightening on the edge of the desk as though trying to hold on to something. Anything. Solid. A circus? Colbert's voice took on an even sharper edge, the venom seeping through. Well, if this is a circus, Denzel, then what does that make you? The dancing bear? The trained seal? He leaned forward further, his words calculated. Because from where I'm sitting, you've been performing for Hollywood's establishment for decades, telling them exactly what they want to hear, playing it safe, never taking real risks. The insult hung in the air like a poisoned dart, each syllable punctuating the attack. Washington had been called many things in his career: demanding, perfectionist, intense, but never safe. Never a sellout. The accusation cut at the heart of his artistic identity. Safe? Washington's voice had gone low again, but now it was thick with barely controlled rage. You want to talk about safe, Stephen? Let's talk about hiding behind a desk and taking cheap shots at people who actually put themselves on the line. Let's talk about building a career on sarcasm and cynicism while contributing absolutely nothing of value to the conversation. The audience, already uncomfortable, had now shifted to genuine distress. Some were looking for the exits. Others sensing they were witnessing television history, though not the kind anyone would want to be remembered for, were quietly recording on their phones. Colbert stood up from his desk, his posture shifting from defensive to overtly confrontational. It was a move that was both theatrical and genuinely threatening. Contributing nothing of value? Colbert's voice was almost a sneer now. I've been holding powerful people accountable for years, while you've been playing dress-up and collecting paychecks from the same studios you now claim to criticize. At least I'm honest about what I do. Honest? Washington let out a bitter laugh, but there was no humor in it. You hide behind comedy every time someone calls you out for being wrong. You attack people's character, their integrity, their life's work, then claim it's all just entertainment when the consequences come home to roost. That's not honesty, Stephen. That's cowardice. The word cowardice struck Colbert like a physical blow. For a split second he froze, his body tensing as though he might leap out of his seat. The tension in the studio was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Audience members began to whisper among themselves, clearly disturbed by what they were witnessing. Cowardly? Colbert's voice was shaking with fury, each word trembling with a mix of disbelief and anger. I face criticism every single night. I put my opinions out there for millions of people to judge. What do you do, Denzel? You hide behind polished PR campaigns and sanitized interviews. You've spent 40 years as Hollywood's golden boy, their safe choice, their dependable product. Washington slowly stood from his chair, his presence suddenly filling the entire set. Towering over the desk, he radiated an undeniable authority that reminded everyone in the studio just who was in their midst, one of the most powerful and respected figures in entertainment. Product. Washington's voice cut through the tension, cool and steady, but the weight of his words slammed into the room like a heavy punch. Is that what you think I am? A product? He took a step forward, the space between them shrinking with every word, his gaze never leaving Colbert's eyes. Let me tell you something about being a product, Stephen. A product does what it's told. A product stays silent when it sees injustice. A product doesn't call out people like you when they're tearing down everything this industry is supposed to stand for. The clash of their wills had reached a fever pitch. Neither man was willing to back down. If anything, they seemed to be feeding off the escalating fury, each insult escalating the confrontation further. The audience, now visibly uneasy, shifted in their seats. Some were rising to leave while others remained frozen, captivated by the spectacle unfolding before them. Washington's words were like a sharp blade, each one cutting deeper, and as his voice reverberated through the studio, the sense that something monumental, something defining, was about to unfold hung heavy in the air. Colbert's face had twisted into something unrecognizable from the genial host millions had grown to know and love. The mask of professionalism had slipped completely, revealing a raw, desperate anger beneath. He stepped away from his desk, abandoning any pretense of decorum. You know what your real problem is, Denzel? Colbert's voice cracked, trembling with barely contained rage. You can't stand that the world has moved on from your kind of Hollywood royalty. You're a relic, a dinosaur clinging to some outdated notion of dignity and respect that died with the studio system. The insult struck with brutal precision, meant to wound as deeply as possible. Even the production crew in the background seemed to recoil, their expressions reflecting the sharpness of Colbert's words. Washington's face twisted from fury to something approaching disbelief. He had weathered decades of professional criticism, setbacks, and the inevitable political games of the industry. But this felt different. This was personal. A dinosaur? His voice dropped to a deadly quiet whisper, each word razor sharp. A dinosaur? Washington took a deliberate step closer to Colbert, the tension now so thick it felt like the air itself was charged. Colbert instinctively backed away. Washington's eyes never left him as he spoke, his voice steady but full of an icy resolve. Let me tell you something about dinosaurs, Stephen. Dinosaurs built this industry. They laid the groundwork for everything you have now. The foundation that lets people like you tear things down for cheap applause. And you know what? I'm not ashamed of that. Building them up? Colbert sneered, a harsh, bitter laugh escaping him. You mean covering for them? Protecting them? Looking the other way when it's convenient? That's what your generation did, Denzel. You built a system where image mattered more than truth, where protecting the facade mattered more than real progress. The accusation was a broadside, its implication so far-reaching that it sucked the oxygen out of the entire room. Washington stood perfectly still, processing the magnitude of what had just been thrown at him. His eyes locked onto Colbert, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made everyone present realize that they were witnessing the end of something. Something irreversible. You don't know what you're talking about, Washington said, his voice quiet but sharp. You sit behind your desk every night making jokes about people's lives, their work, their failures. And you think that gives you insight into who they really are? You think cynicism is the same as wisdom? You think tearing people down is the same as holding them accountable? Colbert, now backed up against his desk, seemed to be unraveling. But his words came out in a rush as though he couldn't stop himself from digging the hole even deeper. At least I don't pretend to be something I'm not. At least I don't wrap myself in false dignity while playing the same games as everyone else. You want to talk about facades? Your entire career has been one carefully constructed facade. Enough. Washington's voice rang out like a thunderclap, every syllable booming through the studio. I've sat here and listened to you insult my work, my integrity, my entire life's dedication to this craft. And I've tried to respond with the respect that this format supposedly deserves. But you don't want respect. You don't want conversation. You want blood. The studio was beyond uncomfortable now. It had descended into something far darker. Fear. The audience, sensing that they were witnessing a train wreck in real time, began filming with their phones, fully aware that this moment would go down in history. Some were quietly slipping toward the exits, unable to bear witness to what felt like the destruction of two careers unfolding before their eyes. Washington turned to face the cameras directly, bypassing Colbert entirely. The cold intensity of his gaze sent a chill through the room as he spoke, addressing the millions watching. I came here tonight to talk about a film I poured my heart and soul into. That's why I'm here. Not for this. Not for you. A story that matters to me, Washington said, his voice low but resolute. A story I believe still matters to the audiences who care about real, meaningful entertainment. Instead, I've been subjected to a character assassination disguised as an interview. Colbert, sensing he was losing control, made one last, desperate attempt to steer the conversation back into his favor. Character assassination? His voice cracked with an edge of disbelief. Denzel, you came on my show. Nobody forced you to be here. If you can't handle a few tough questions about your public statements, maybe you shouldn't make public statements. Washington turned to him, his expression cold, equal parts pity and disdain. Tough questions, Stephen. He raised an eyebrow. You haven't asked me a single tough question tonight. You've thrown out accusations, hurled insults, and tried to manufacture controversy where none existed. That's not journalism. That's not even good television. That's just sad. The word reenactment lingered in the air like a final crushing judgment, each syllable sinking in deeper than anything that had come before. Colbert's face went through a quick succession of expressions: anger, confusion, something that might have been shame, before settling into a defensive fury. Sad? You know what's really sad, Denzel? A 70-year-old man who can't accept that his time is over, who refuses to adapt to a world where people don't just bow down to movie stars because they've been around forever. It was the final straw. Washington stood in silence for a long beat, then slowly shook his head with something approaching genuine sorrow. "You're right about one thing, Stephen," Washington said, his voice cool but cutting. "My time here is over." Without another word, he began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate, each click of the wire echoing through the studio. "It's not because I'm a dinosaur, or because I can't adapt," he continued, his tone unwavering. "It's because I refuse to participate in this kind of spectacle. I refuse to let my work, my reputation, my integrity be used as fodder for your need to create viral moments." The silence in the studio became deafening. Even Colbert seemed to realize he had pushed this moment beyond the point of no return. He stared at Washington, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words to salvage his position, but found none. Washington carefully placed the microphone on the guest chair, a move that felt like the ceremonial end of something that could never be undone. "I've been in this business for 40 years, he said, his voice carrying the kind of gravity that only decades of experience could give. "I've worked with legends. I've worked with newcomers. I've worked with journalists, comedians, talk show hosts, everyone in between. And I've never walked out of an interview in my entire career." He paused, letting the weight of that statement hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. "But I've also never been treated with such blatant disrespect by someone who claims to represent the best of what this medium can offer." Washington turned toward Colbert, who had gone pale, his face a portrait of shock. The words came out like a eulogy, final and irrevocable. "You're not the worst interviewer I've ever encountered, Stephen. You're not even the rudest, but you might just be the most disappointing." With those final devastating words, Washington turned and began walking toward the exit. The cameras followed him, their lenses capturing every step of what would become one of the most replayed moments in talk show history. The studio audience was frozen in stunned silence. Some were filming on their phones, their eyes wide as they realized the gravity of the situation unfolding before them. Others simply stared at the ground, unable to look up after witnessing the destruction of what had once been a cordial interview. Colbert, left standing alone, seemed at a loss for what to do next. His eyes darted around, toward his producers, toward the cameras, toward the audience, but found no guidance, no support. For perhaps the first time in his career, Stephen Colbert was completely, utterly speechless. As Washington reached the edge of the set, he paused, not turning around but still speaking with an icy calm. "For what it's worth, Stephen," he said, his voice measured, "I hope you figure out the difference between being provocative and being destructive. This industry needs people who can ask tough questions. It doesn't need people who mistake cruelty for courage." And with that, Denzel Washington walked off the set of The Late Show, leaving behind a stunned, speechless Colbert and a studio full of onlookers caught in the whirlwind of what had just transpired. A host scrambling to salvage his reputation, a television moment that would be dissected and debated for years to come. For the first time in 4 decades, Washington had found a line he wouldn't cross, even if it meant walking away from everything he had come to accomplish on that stage. He had walked away not just from Colbert, but from the kind of spectacle that threatened to turn everything he stood for into a joke. The cameras kept rolling for a few more seconds, capturing Colbert's stunned expression and the eerie silence that filled the air. This wasn't just a talk show appearance gone wrong. It was a breakdown of civility, the destruction of mutual respect, and the collapse of professional courtesy, all captured for the world to see. It was television at its most raw, its most unforgiving, and ultimately its most unforgettable.